All right, I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa White. I'm the Environmental Justice Coordinator for NMED, and I'm just helping out the Clean Transportation Fuel Standard folks by facilitating. I'd like to welcome everyone who's attending, including the advisory committee members in the room and online, members of the public in the room and online, the NMED staff who are here to support, as well as our technical team who are essential as well. In case there are any new folks here today, the bathroom and Wi-Fi information is on the doors. Members of the public, you'll be able to listen today. Members of the advisory committee, you will be able to speak. Please raise your hand, either online or in real life, if you would like to speak and wait to be called on. I'm sorry. Somebody maybe is not muted. And we'll keep track of who raises their hand in what order and make sure that you are called on if the time allows. For folks online, we ask that you keep your video off unless you're speaking. This helps with the bandwidth in some way. And as a reminder, the chat function is for IT purposes only. So if you're having issues with audio or video, you can put a message in the chat and someone will help you. But please don't post substantive questions or comments in the chat. We won't respond to them or track them. Instead, raise your hand. And I think at this point we can do a roll call. Pam Jones of NMED, would you please do the roll call?
Yes, I will. Thank you. Good morning. Member Babe, are you present?
Yes, present.
Member Brown?
Yes, good morning. I'm here.
Good morning. Member Willingham? Anthony Willingham? Member Bartlett? I think I saw your name online. If you could unmute yourself.
Oh, that's good. So I said to her, well, let me just hold your hand on the dock. But, it was like moving, and she did well. He even said to me, this was like a trial run. He goes, I see what you
We have someone who's speaking. Could you please mute yourself online?
I think we've got everybody muted. Yes, I muted that person. Okay, lost my train of thought here. Member Lynch, are you present? Please unmute yourself. I know I saw your name. Kara Lynch?
Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, I hear you. Thank you. I'm going to go back and ask for Member Willingham again. Okay. Member Wind, Corianne Wind?
Yes, present today.
Hi. Member Klein, Daniel Klein?
I'm here online.
Thank you, Member. Member Molenberg, Dalva Molenberg?
I'm present online, thank you.
I see you. Member Barrientos, Eduardo Barrientos?
Good morning, present.
I see you. Okay. Member Epstein?
Hi, good morning.
Hi. Member Rosenberg? Okay, we'll circle back. Member Pasiniak?
Hi, good morning. I'm present.
Good morning. Member Noyes?
Graham Noyes, present. Thank you.
I hear you. Thank you. Member Sadler, Jane Sadler?
Present online.
Member Smith, Jed Smith? Member Gregg, Jessica Gregg?
Present.
Good morning. Member Serena, Joe Serena?
Present.
Member Buttonhoff?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Member Feldman? Member Funk?
Present.
I saw you here. Okay, good morning. Member Reyes, Luis Reyes? Member Wire, Matthew Wire?
I'm here. Thank you.
Member Teague, Michael Teague?
I'm here online.
Member Hagevort?
Good morning, I'm present online.
Good morning. Member Wade, Sam Wade?
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Member Sosa, Teresa Sosa?
Good morning. Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Member Wallace Pollock? I saw you.
Present, good morning.
Good morning. Member Trauman, Todd Trauman?
Good morning, I'm present.
Member Dahlmeyer?
Present.
Good morning. Chair Madsen?
I'm here, thank you.
Good morning. And Member Krishnamurthy?
Present, good morning.
Good morning. Let me run through those who have not responded yet just to make sure. Member Rosenberg?
Present.
Oh, good morning. Member Smith? Okay. Member Feldman? And Member Reyes? Okay, Madam Facilitator, you do have a quorum.
I have a couple of announcements from Claudia Borchard of New Mexico Environment Department. Claudia, are you online yet? Not sure. I think she's logging on right now. I think they're pretty simple announcements that I could make, or you could make. Would you like me to start them? Okay. And if you see Claudia coming online, let me know. So, NMED, New Mexico Environment Department, would appreciate submittals of content for the Advisory Committee Technical Report. I think all Advisory Committee members know how to do that at this point. Is that correct? Or, yeah? If you're not sure how to submit those comments, please check in with Owen Peterson. He can help you out. The technical report will be mailed out this coming Tuesday, and it will be discussed at the final advisory committee meeting on July 26th. So we'd love to have your. I'm sorry, what? Oh, July 23 is when we'll send out the report. Okay. The final report. And there is no meeting on July 19th. So I think those are all the announcements. And if Claudia joins and has more to say, we'll give her time for that. So now we'd like to.
Good morning.
Oh,
Good
are
morning.
You
Are
here?
you guys
Hi,
able to
Claudia.
see me?
Yeah. So, Claudia, I made the 3 brief announcements that are listed in our paperwork. Did you have more that you'd like to share?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Apologize for joining remotely today. You guys can all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, great. So I just wanted to review, besides what I heard Melissa just say, that the email, I just sent you all an email that the deadline for the submittals is this Monday, right? And I just want to make sure that you all have been getting my emails and that you're aware of how to make submittals. Is there anybody who doesn't feel like they've been kept in the loop on this? If you, maybe we should make this easier. And if you have not received my emails and you're not quite sure how to submit technical input, reach out to me by email and we'll make sure that you get all that information. Okay? And then the other part has to do with attribution. My emails from you have said that we've decided to not attribute comments to anyone, and we're modifying that a little bit unless you want that to be the case, right? Some of you may want to submit technical input and have that be known as comments that you and or your organization have submitted. So if you want to have your content be attributed to you and your organization, then please make sure we know that. And then also there have been some concerns raised about the members feeling like comments may not reflect the views of members here and or their organizations. And so we're proposing to add language to the report that will be something like, these contributions, this input was given by individuals and may not reflect the perspective, point of view, opinion of others on the committee, so that we make it really clear that this is, and we'll be clear about how we gathered the technical input for the report, and hopefully also make it clear that what's included in the report may not be everyone may not agree with input in the report. So just want to run that by you all, and I can't see you very well, but is there anybody who has concerns with this approach?
Yes, Lloyd Funk with Phillips 66. Just want to make sure I heard you correctly. On these comments that are due Monday, we can submit them under our company identification or submit them anonymously. Is that what you said?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
And I guess a procedural question, is there a preference in submitting all comments at once or having, sets of comments being submitted throughout the week? The reason I ask is that the deadline is on the 22nd, and I know you guys have to put the report by the 23rd. So is there a preference from the Environment Department to make the process more agile and effective?
Thank you. That's exactly what we're trying to recognize here, is that when I put down the 22nd, it is actually the 15th. It's a week earlier. It's Monday, this Monday. The way to make the process more agile for us, so we have, as you know, now identified prompts, and we will collect information, and in the report we'll have that prompt, and then we'll have every single response that came in under that prompt. We're using the software Coda as a way to help make that more agile and easier for us. And now the new addition based on comments we've received is, that it could say that Claudia submitted this comment because I want my name to be by that. But if I don't ask for that under that prompt, instead of saying Claudia submitted this, it'll just say, here was a technical input on this under this prompt. And all the other content that doesn't neatly fit under the prompts, we will organize into, appropriate topics and include that as well, but not under the prompts.
Thank you, Claudia. Go ahead.
This is Alaric Babe from PNM. Just a quick question on the timeline. So 9 a.m. July 15th essentially means that they're due today. And so I would request from the Environment Department some flexibility there. I'm happy to try and get them done, but there's no way that I will get these through my organization by Monday morning.
That's fair.
Second that.
Let me turn to Owen in the room. Owen, what do you think is a reasonable time for you to get some deadline, when we get these, I'm sorry?
Hi, yes. I'll just flip the question kind of back on the group. How much additional time would it take? I think we do have some flexibility.
I mean, I think midweek generally would be okay. I just need to be able to get it through, and it just won't happen this afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah, we really apologize for that mistake on my part for the date. I don't know what I was thinking when I set out the wrong date, but anyway. So midweek, what if we say close of business Wednesday?
That's feasible for me, for sure. And just to your question, Eduardo, yes, there's a strong preference for submitting all of the input in one form at once. It just makes my life easier compiling it all. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. So if it's okay, we're going to move ahead here.
Excuse me, Madam Facilitator,
Yes.
Member Bartlett had his hand
Oh,
up. I
I'm
don't know if
sorry.
he has a comment he wants to make.
Go ahead, Member Bartlett.
Alaric, it was already addressed by Alaric. We had the same
Okay.
concerns about a Monday morning deadline.
Great. Thank you. So let's move on to approval of today's agenda. Pam, could you, we'll invite a motion to approve the agenda from an advisory committee member. If anyone would like to make that motion.
Joe Serena, I'd like to make a motion to approve the agenda as proposed.
Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you.
Travis Madsen.
Okay, and Pam Jones, could you record the vote count?
Yes, I believe we can do this vote by acclamation. All in favor of accepting the agenda as written, say aye or raise your hand if you're online.
That's everyone in the room.
Are there any nays, either in the room or online? The motion to accept the agenda has passed.
Awesome, thank you. And now we'll move on to approval of the June 21st meeting minutes. I hope that you've all received a copy of this. And if folks are ready, we invite a motion to approve those June 21 meeting minutes. Is there a motion from an advisory committee member or questions or discussion?
Motion to approve.
Motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
That was a motion by Member Funk and a second by Member Babe.
Thank
By
you.
Member Epstein.
Epstein, okay, thank you.
And could you record the vote, please?
Well, thank you. All in favor of accepting the June 21st minutes, say aye or raise your hand online, please. Aye. Are there any noes? No votes for the minutes? The minutes are approved, Madam Facilitator.
Thank you. And now we're ahead of time, which is great because it means we can possibly have more discussion later. So today we'll have a series of presentations and discussion on the topics of fossil gasoline, fossil diesel, and their lower carbon intensity substitutes, clean fuel credit market dynamics, and environmental justice considerations. So I'll introduce the first presenter in just a moment. And then just to let you know, as we've done before, there'll be a presentation of about 10 minutes. Then we'll have discussion of about 10 minutes based on prompts that were developed by the Clean Transportation Fuel Standards team, but I'll say them to you. We have lots of prompts, so we'll see how many we can get through. If we have extra time later in the meeting that's available for additional discussion, I can bring those prompts up then. I think we'll have a break around 10:25. We'll have about a 10-minute break. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Brian Bartlett from Valero, who will speak about fossil gasoline, fossil diesel, and their lower carbon intensity substitutes.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
And yeah, I'll just add as well, we will give you an NFL-style 2-minute warning when you hit the 8-minute mark. Yeah, my mic is like permanently on, so I just always assume I'm on. But sadly for you all, you will not be hearing as much from me today. Just kidding. We are going to highlight the many talents, and Ethan, you can stop laughing now. And the many talents and skills of our fine advisory committee panel. Most of whom are remote, except Jed, I believe, has, or somebody from Rio Valley. Are you Jed?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Jed will be the only in-person presenter. The other 4 will be remote. I have a single master deck. Just tell me when to change your slides, and I will change them. Thank you.
And Brian, I know we used up a little bit of your 10 minutes, so I'm going to restart your clock now.
Very, very good. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So as you've heard, we were asked to speak on the CTFS regulated fuels, and then a little bit on New Mexico transportation fuel supply chains. So if you will move me forward, Michael. So ultimately, when we think about what and how we look at regulated fuels, we need to start with what's in the statutory components here. And so the statute's really short, but it covers very specific set of requirements. And what you see on the screen is a subset of the statutory definitions and statutory requirements. The key items on this page are really to look at the fact that we are obviously looking for carbon intensity of fuels, and we are looking at a full life cycle of those fuels. The key here is how the state of New Mexico and legislature has chosen to define transportation fuel. In this case, they've chosen to have transportation fuel mean that it is electricity or a liquid, gaseous, or blended fuel. This is a little bit different than the way that it's handled in other programs, and we'll get a little bit more detail on that later, but it does change the way that New Mexico's program is viewed versus maybe a California or an Oregon or a Washington. The other key attributes of this is that obviously the NMED has got until July 1st, 26 to promulgate rules. We've got some examples a little bit later that use a 26 start date, but we'll talk through that as well. The second piece of this is really what is the meat of it, and that is that they're charged with establishing a clean or a statewide technology neutral transportation fuel with annually decreasing carbon intensity transportation fuel targets. And so what does that mean? That means that when we kick off the program, that first year, everybody will have something. Now, nothing says that curve has to be linear, but it does say that there has to be an annual decrease in carbon number as we approach the targets. The second piece of this is that there is a clean standard for each fuel that requires a reduction in carbon intensity for, again, transportation fuel by at least 20% by 2018 and 30% from 2018 levels by 2040. Again, going back to the definition of transportation fuel, we're looking at electricity or liquid, gaseous, or blended fuel. This is different than other programs. Michael, if you want to move on to the next slide for me. What does this really mean? So how is this different from other states' LCFS programs? Well, New Mexico is really the first state to define transportation fuel as electricity or liquid, gaseous, or blended fuel, and to require that all transportation fuels meet a mandated CI reduction by 2030 and 2040. As we've mentioned, this is different than how it's handled in other states. In other states, the obligations rest either on the fossil gasoline, the CBOB in this case, or on a diesel, and the reductions are primarily accomplished through a blending of low carbon CI or lower CI components or via fuel displacement. So that makes the New Mexico program different from the rest of the programs. What does this mean? So when we think about it, what it means is, has been mentioned previously, is that it will result, at least for gas and diesel, in lower starting CI baselines, because each of those fuels are or contain some combination of a renewable fuel that has a lower carbon intensity number. It also means that each of those components, each of those transportation fuels, will require its own baseline. So, for example, in an E10 or a B2, both of those can be looked at under the statute as either a liquid fuel or a blended fuel. But it doesn't matter really where they end up, because ultimately the only way to get a carbon intensity reduction on those is to look at each individual component of the transportation fuel and then set a baseline for each of those items to have a reduction across the curve. And the example below looks at what this means. So kind of the left-hand side of the equation, effectively you're looking at an E10 blend. And so the left-hand side of the equation looks at it from what I would call the liquid side. And so you're looking at a CBOB on a percentage basis with the carbon intensity, and that carbon intensity number is a calculation that comes from some of the discussions that we've had, and I'll back into that for you in just a second. The second or third input then is looking at an energy density, and I've simply grabbed the energy density from the California model. And then we move on to the ethanol side of the equation, which looks at ethanol on a percentage base, and then an ethanol CI. That ethanol CI is tied back to the reference for the CI that's published in the Opus for California ethanol quotes. That covers both LA and San Francisco. So what does that mean? That means that that's just kind of the marker point for where ethanol prices, and it's expected to come in at or above that level, or at or below that level, and then be adjusted by the individual counterparties. The last piece of this equation then is obviously the energy density for ethanol resulting in the blended fuel. What does all this mean, right? Ultimately, what it means is that if you start off on the far right and you start off with a blended fuel, the only way to understand how to get to, say, a 90 target, which is one of the numbers that's been talked about by the group, is to actually know what the CBOB intensity is and what the ethanol intensity is. And that can only be calculated by knowing what those individual components make up. And then you can get to a baseline. The challenge with this is that it creates an obligation for both sets of fuels, where in other programs, the obligations rest on the CBOB component alone. So how does that really play into what happens? And we'll get into that. We'll do some illustrative examples here in a few minutes. But one of the things the statute has done in the way that it's drafted is it creates additional complexity specifically for blended fuels as they come into the state. This is not necessarily an issue that will be encumbered for the other obligated fuels. So let's move on to the next page for me, Michael. So in this case, what we're really looking at is on an electricity basis, what would this look like? And we're making an assumption in this particular example, and obviously it's NMDE on how they get there. But when we look at this using an EPA grid basis, ultimately a 22 statewide average had reached a 26% reduction versus 2018, and would ultimately be a net credit generator for all kilowatt hours used for transportation. So you can, if you look at the table that's here, you can see that in 18 it was 608 grams per kilowatt hour, and by 2022 it had dropped to 449.8. That is primarily attributed to the introduction of wind and solar, heavily predominant on wind, if I recall from the eGrid data. So one of the things to think about, what does that mean from an obligation perspective? Under this program, what you would look towards is the credits generated for electricity used as transportation would use the same kind of baseline, the 2018 baseline, minus the current year's application, and then would take it based on the fuels, the volume of fuel put into the transportation market. And then it's a simple calculation from grams to metric tons, and you can see what credits get generated. The key here is that when we think about this, as one of the questions was asked previously, is that like all other obligated fuels under the CTFS, electricity should be handled on a statewide basis, and then on a statewide industry average, with compliance or credit generation occurring at the utility level, the same way that liquid, blended, and gaseous fuels are attributable to the obligated party, if that makes sense. And so, Michael, if you want to move on to the next page for me.
And Brian, sorry to interrupt, but this is your 8-minute alert.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, we'll move much faster. So this is just an example that looks at the at an E10 gasoline. As you can see, you've got a 90 base plugged in, and to the right, you see the CI column on the standard, and you can see what the reduction obligations are, where the CI net is. The next two sections look at CBOB and ethanol, and you can see what the reduction curves are. Basically what you see here, and the key output of this item, is that both CBOB and ethanol generate deficits against the baseline unless the actual CI of the fuel components are reduced. Michael, you want to move on to the next one for me? All right, diesel does the exact same thing, and so again, you can see what the baselines look like based on a 92 B2, what the diesel would be, and the biodiesel, and again, obligations with deficits created for both the diesel and the biodiesel component out the curve, unless there's actually a reduction against those items. Like one final note on regulated fuels in the statute, while New Mexico has different obligated fuels and baselines, much of the underlying programs will be very consistent with other programs. That would include things like pathway processes, verifications, those types of things. The key here is really in how do you calculate the obligations, what are the baselines, and what is the statute said as far as those obligations are concerned. So we'll move very quickly next to the transportation fuel supply chains. This is an attempt to simplify some of the maps that you guys have seen earlier. So this is all based on EIA data. What you can see is that you have the red arrows will indicate that you have product that is imported from the Gulf Coast and ultimately makes its way into the New Mexico marketplace. The blue arrows indicate product that is moving from Mid-Continent refiners or the El Paso refinery into the systems for supply. Each of the triangles represent the terminals. Things to keep in mind is that we've seen a significant increase in the amount of volume that is being supplied into New Mexico and frankly on into western Colorado with several pipe expansions or system revamps, if you will, that came off of the reconfiguration of the eastern, off the Enterprise Texas Western system. Michael, you want to move to the next page for me? This page covers truck supply. I think one of the things that's important for all the members to understand and for the environmental department to understand is that a large percentage of the volume that goes into the New Mexico marketplace is imported via trucks. And so the graphic here, anything that's in red, or shaded in the reddish pink color, indicates that those are trucks that are coming from Texas. And so those volumes ultimately are products that are purchased in Texas and transported into the New Mexico marketplace. The key takeaway here is that those importers become the obligated party. And in most cases, that is a small marketer, a small jobber, or a station owner. And New Mexico will have a significantly increased number of obligated parties versus the other programs. Second item to consider here is that every truckload that comes across will contain a combination of deficit and credit generating fuels. So for instance, if you have an E10 with a CBOB and a very low cellulosic or carbon sequestration based ethanol, you'll have deficits on the 90% and credits generated on the 10%. Ultimately, what does this mean for the system? It's a lot more tracking. It's a lot more complex in terms of what has to be done. And the parties that are having to do that are not parties who are typically used to being regulated. So these are your mom and pop stations, your jobbers, and so forth. One of the key things here, if you look at the map, eastern New Mexico has been predominantly supplied coming out of the markets in the panhandle of Texas, but all of the supply in the Las Cruces and lower southwest corner is coming from products that are actually coming out of either the Gulf Coast or coming out of the refinery in El Paso and then trucked across. There are no pipes there are no terminals inside of New Mexico in that particular region. One last thing that I'll wrap up on, and we can move on to questions, and that is from a biofuels logistics perspective, the E10 logistics are really in place. And so that runs on rail and truck supply products to the terminals, which is then blended. None of that goes into the pipelines. There is some limited infrastructure for biodiesel and potentially for some renewable diesel, particularly for one party in the state. And then certainly limits on EV charging. So one thing to keep in mind as we move forward on a program is that terminal infrastructure projects to build out to be able to handle these incremental products and handle the types of fuels take typically 1 to 2 years to complete, and they require long-term capital commitments. So I think with that, I'll open it to whatever prompts you guys have created.
Thank you so much, Brian. So we have 2 prompts for discussion. The first one is, and we have about,
Claudia's
I think,
raised her hand.
Oh, Claudia, okay. Claudia, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That was really interesting presentation. I would just want to make sure I understand perhaps what might be an interpretation difference in how you see the New Mexico program working versus maybe the way we've been thinking about it. And so are you interpreting the statute to mean that every single fuel will be treated individually versus transportation fuel treated collectively as an average reduction in the CI?
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head in a couple of different ways, Claudia. So first off, when we look at this, we're looking at it from the definition that's provided in the statute, and it is a different definition than is in any other statute. In this case, the New Mexico legislature has defined transportation fuels specifically as being electricity, liquid, gaseous, or in this case, blended fuels. And that's the one that creates the biggest sets of challenges, because that effectively says that you're going to have that blended fuel is a transportation fuel. And ultimately, to get to what is a blended value, you have to understand what are the component inputs. So what is the carbon intensity number of the gasoline or the CBOB that's made up that product? And then what is the definition, what is the carbon intensity of the ethanol that was blended into that product? And then secondarily, the statute requirements under C2 look at it and require the transportation fuel, which points back to the definition, needs to be reduced, which would indicate that the statute is calling for a reduction of blended fuels, of gaseous fuels, of liquid fuels, and of electricity, each as a standalone item. Certainly there are different ways to attack and look at how do you do the calculations. And Michael and I have had a little bit of discussion on this, but I know it's come up on multiple occasions over the last 2 meetings that the baselines for gasoline and diesel will be lower because they intrinsically include a renewable fuel, which will lower the baseline for the base fuel. That makes sense?
Yeah, I mean and I'm glad we're having this discussion because I think that this is definitely bears more conversation. I think we're going to have to put a pin in this for the purposes of this AC meeting. I mean, except for others who might want to chime in there, but I just I think that this is going to bear more discussion because this is not the way we're thinking about this program as the interpretation that you have surfaced here, and I think it's worth having more conversations about. We are thinking about our program following the type of program that the other states have implemented. And
Claudia, I completely agree with the perspective in terms of where you're coming from. This was in part intended to look at statute and just say, what is the statute telling us? And so, certainly there needs to be a lot of discussion around what do these fuels look like, and how do we manage the obligations around them. But this program, because it incorporates blended fuels into the statutes and then sets requirements for reductions of the blended fuels, frankly, for electricity and gaseous and liquid as well, is different in the way that the other programs are drafted. Those programs, like in the case of California, specifically start with the baseline for gasoline comes from California RFG, which no longer exists. That product was converted pre-implementation, but post-rule setting to a CARB-based fuel. And then in Oregon and Washington, what they do is that they actually call out electricity. They are considered transportation fuels, but then they call them out as non-deficit creating transportation fuels in the rules, in the statutes. And then those fuels then create credits versus being part of the reduction obligation.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for this, and I think we should go on to other people who have questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia and Brian. Travis?
This is Travis Madsen from SWEEP. Claudia, I had the same reaction to thinking about breaking all the transportation fuels up into separate baselines. And the way I read the statute, I'm imagining one baseline for 2018, incorporating all the different transportation fuels that were used in the state during that year in whatever volumes or energy quantities that were consumed, and having one baseline number.
Travis, how do obligated parties participate if there's a singular baseline number for all transportation fuels? What does that really look like?
There'd be one baseline number, and then fuels would either create a credit or a deficit based on where they come in on their carbon intensity relative to that baseline.
So you're looking at it even from a different perspective than the California, Washington, and Oregon perspective, which have baselines for gas and diesel, and then have reductions based upon the fuels that are used to blend into them or displace them. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not intimately familiar with how California and Oregon do their baselines, but the simplest way I could imagine doing this would be having one baseline and then seeing where each fuel comes in, in the future years when we're implementing the program in terms of whether they're creating a credit or a deficit.
Thank you for your comments. I'm going to take two comments from online. This is an important topic, but probably move along. And we may not have time for the prompts, but what I could do is read them to you so that you can prepare to give comment on them on the technical report if you like. Does that sound good? Okay. So next is Gabe online.
Hi. Thanks, Brian, for the presentation. Just want to echo that I don't think that this is the only legal interpretation of the statute, and that appreciate your interpretation. Also wanted to ask if you are an attorney.
No, I'm not an attorney. And yes, I appreciate the feedback on it. And look, certainly there needs to be incremental discussion amongst the group, but really within NMED around what are these interpretations. And I would actually challenge them to look further into the reg and look at some of the other challenging components that are inside of the statute, like how they handle the differences between a CCS CCM market price and then developing off-ramps that could be conflicting with those CCMs because those will send conflicting market signals.
Go ahead, Michelle.
I would just add that, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Brian. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. I think that's a novel interpretation that you've presented, and the Environment Department will definitely consider it.
Thank you, Michelle. And next is Wish.
Yes, thank you very much. That was an interesting presentation, Brian. I'm trying to figure it out. I have the same questions everybody else has asked, because I was thinking of it essentially as any fuel that's there currently will have a baseline, and any replacement of that fuel in the application will have a CI score, and that delta is essentially what the credit should be based on. Because otherwise, if you start saying each one of these fuels should have a reduced threshold or whatever, however it's blended, at the end of the day, that means biodiesel will start with a very low baseline, I mean the bio part of it at least, and then it has to keep going down. Otherwise, you don't get credit. That will not help reduce the CI score of the overall effort. So I'm a little confused about this too. So I agree with you, Claudia. We need a lot more separate discussion on this thing to clarify.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Wish. Appreciate it. If it's quick, can you do quick?
Yeah, just quick.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Lloyd Funk, Phillips 66. My point is, regardless of how you do your baseline, Brian brings up an interesting point, is that you're going to have to track all of the fuel entering into the state, and regardless of what baseline you use to compare of, you're going to have a CI value for that fuel. A lot of this fuel comes from out of the state, and the renewable fuel as well. What are you going to establish as the CI of that fuel coming in, whether it's renewable or not, when it's a fungible system, and how are you going to track that, and how are you going to incent somebody to track their renewable portion outside of the state separately when you don't have LCFSs in your surrounding states? You need to figure out how you're going to do that.
Thank you so much. This is obviously a hot topic, and I hope it'll generate substantial comments on the advisory committee report. What I'm going to do now is read the prompts that we don't have time to discuss, but they will also be typed into the chat so you can capture them, and if you like, put in more comment in the technical report. So the first prompt is, how will New Mexico's Clean Transportation Fuel Standard program need to regulate deficit-generating fuels in New Mexico differently than processes in West Coast states? Second prompt, what might NMED incorporate into the CTFS program to attract businesses and supply chains to New Mexico? NMED is interested in learning more about specific drop-in credit-generating fuels. Okay? All right, so if it's okay, we'll move on now to a presentation by Jed Smith, Rio Valley Biofuels and Renewable Diesel Production. Please go ahead, Jed, and you have, just like Brian, 10 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, just make sure to hold that down there, Jay.
Good morning. He's got me.
Thank you. And just tell me to change the slides when you need to.
Okay, thanks. He's got it. Okay. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Okay, good morning. Appreciate you guys having me. My name is Jed Smith. I'm the COO and founder of Rio Valley Biofuels. We were one of the many companies that will benefit from the implementation of a New Mexico Clean Fuel Transportation Standard. Even without a clean fuel standard, we currently are delivering biodiesel to many customers in New Mexico as well as customers across the Southwest. Next slide. Rio Valley Biofuels started producing biodiesel in April of 2006. We merged with Global Alternative Fuels in 2014 and are producing 17 million gallons a year as we speak right now. We started producing biodiesel from used cooking oil in 2006 in Anthony, New Mexico. In May of 2014, we moved our whole operation to El Paso, Texas, and combined with Global Alternative Fuels. Next slide. I want to briefly explain how biodiesel is produced. Biodiesel can be produced from any vegetable oil or animal fat. Used cooking oil, which we use at Real Valley, is the lowest carbon feedstock because it is recycled and would have been discarded in landfills, but instead is recycled and turned into fuel. To produce biodiesel, we combine vegetable oil with methanol and catalysts in a process called transesterification. We heat the mixture and then allow it to settle in series of tanks, which separates the biodiesel from the co-products glycerin. Next slide. At Real Valley, when I started at Real Valley Biofuels, my goal was to help. Hold on, I missed a slide. Sorry about that.
Let me just go back to that.
I think we're good here. At Real Valley, we were producing used cooking oil, biodiesel collected from New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Colorado, and California. Biodiesel is most commonly used in blends with ULSD. Biodiesel's blends are identified as percentages of biodiesel in the blend. For example, 20% biodiesel blended with 80% ULSD is called B20. This blend is used commonly throughout New Mexico and Texas year-round. Other blends are B5, B10, B99, and B100. Many of our customers send their trucks to pick up biodiesel at our plant, and we also ship biodiesel to our customers in our trucks as well. Next slide. All biodiesel produced at Real Valley Biofuels exceeds or the ASTM D6751 standards. Our quality control program consists of in-house testing of each batch produced along with quarterly testing by independent labs. Next slide. This is very important to understand. Compared to other biomass-based diesel fuels, biodiesel has the lowest production costs, the highest feedstock efficiency, and the highest emission reduction performance, and the lowest carbon abatement costs. This has been determined by several different scientific studies. I want to make sure and make a point here because it is important that all aspects of the production of each fuel be reviewed with establishing New Mexico's clean transportation fuel standard. It is critical that we capture all the energy and full life cycle of all the raw materials used in the production. That's for all the different categories of fuels that will fall under this standard. It is very important that New Mexico does not choose favorites by the way the carbon intensity is calculated for each fuel. My statement about biodiesel has been proven scientifically, and that's why I'm saying that the accurate calculation will show that. Questions have been raised around the energy content and life cycles have been calculated federally and in some states for renewable diesel. Next slide. I was asked to discuss how clean fuel standards benefits producers like Real Valley Biofuels. I want to make a few points here. First, the implementation of clean fuel standard benefits biofuel producers because it creates demand in those particular states for low carbon fuels. But I want to make it clear that markets already exist for biofuels. Currently, we sell all the fuel that we produce and there is excess demand. Most of the biodiesel that we produce in New Mexico is sold in other states, Texas, California, etc. It is important that we develop a clean fuel standards for New Mexico that benefits New Mexico and New Mexicans. Next slide. When I started at Real Valley Biofuels, my goal was to help the communities where I live to have a better, cleaner fuel that would reduce emissions in a cost-effective way. The New Mexico Clean Fuel Standard has the potential to make that happen. To successfully meet the goals of this program, it is critical that we establish a program that correctly evaluates the carbon intensity of each fuel through the complete life cycle. In some programs through the years, all inputs have not been correctly counted, and this makes these programs less effective than they could be. It is very important that we do the research to eliminate and evaluate the projected deficits and credits so we don't create a gold rush where the value of the credits goes away way up and then crashes down. I'm sure that biodiesel will be one of the simplest, most obvious solutions to the clean fuel demand in New Mexico, and Real Valley is poised to contribute to providing affordable biodiesel to customers in New Mexico. Next slide.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Jed. It looks like we might have 11 minutes or more, a little bit more, for discussions. So I will share with you the first prompt. What role do we envision drop-in biofuels playing in New Mexico's Clean Transportation Fuel Standard? It's really an open discussion question, but if you'd like to contribute, you're welcome to. Yes. What role do we envision drop-in biofuels playing in New Mexico's CTFS? Go ahead.
So that's going to be a huge role that biofuels will play in renewable diesel, most likely. For one, it's already happening. The infrastructure, I hear some talk that the infrastructure is not all the way there, and I agree with parts of that. And then the other places, there are infrastructure that is in place that already is receiving the biofuel and the drop-in fuels. So I see it being a huge role and the easiest one to get to with this program.
Thank you, Jed. Are there any other comments or questions? Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. This is Corey Ann Wynn from Clean Fuels Alliance, and so we represent biodiesel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuels. So I do think there's a huge opportunity in New Mexico for drop-in biofuels. I think I heard reference to like a B2 maybe that was going to be in the 2018 baseline, and so there's a lot of room on the biodiesel side to get up to a 20% or even more than that, and then obviously for renewable diesel to come in and play a role as well. So I do think that it can be, like Jed mentioned, it exists already in a lot of supply, maybe not physically in New Mexico, but in close proximity to New Mexico. So I do think that that's going to be a good opportunity.
Thank you, Corianne. Any other comments or questions about this issue? I see one hand raised. Gabe, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks. Really appreciate the presentation. Just as a reminder on the legal side, all regulatory rationale for this program has to not discriminate based on state of origin. So just a reminder to NMED that you should not make any comments suggesting that economic development in state is any regulatory rationale.
Thank you for that. Wish, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Instead of thinking of it as why the CTFS program, how will it need to regulate a deficit generating fuel, I would look at it as, to the earlier points, developing infrastructure to allow cleaner fuels to be integrated, whether it is biodiesel as a drop-in replacement or even biomethane as a natural gas conversion. So there are many ways to go about this where you would not force the production guys to regulate something, but rather encourage them to produce something that's more cleaner, to just Gabe's point. You're not forcing anything in that way. You're encouraging a cleaner alternative. That's the way I would see it as a CTFS, kind of generating something rather than need to regulate something. So.
Thank you for your comments. Oh, yes, please go ahead, Judd.
So if I may, so I've done a lot of supply in California and following that program over there. And what Gabe was just mentioning happens kind of automatically because for me, California has their calculator that they established the carbon offset of biodiesel, and we go by that. And we look at the different data points that we put in from our particular plant, and every plant or every producer of fuel will have to do this and look at that. And we improved our plant to get a better CI value over into California, product into California. So by this kind of a program, and I'm not saying everything necessarily is right with California or wrong with California, but with this kind of a program, it does put the ball in the producer's court to reduce their carbon, therefore they benefit from a better credit value at that point.
Thank you. I'm going to move us along to the next prompt. It is specifically, how might the logistics and production processes for RD present any unique advantages or challenges?
And you can include with RD biodiesel too, just replace RD with biofuels in general. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Late edit.
It's okay.
And that's the infrastructure points that were raised last time in our last meeting.
Any comments or questions, or would like it ready?
Joe Serena from Chevron.
Go ahead, Joe.
No, I think that the unique challenges allude back to the way that conventional fuels have been transported into the state, either by truck or in state production. The infrastructure of importing, say, a B100, for instance, into a terminal either by truck or rail, that seems pretty straightforward. But even those are smaller volumes. In the West Coast states, they have the ability to bring in large bulk marine vessels and track it on that sort of scale. So the degree that suppliers are doing many more smaller volumes into states, even if there's an ability to bring it in as a pure component, may present unique challenges for New Mexico.
Thank you, Joe. Corianne, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I think partially this response is, the comment goes back to what Lloyd was saying in the previous presentation about bringing in truckloads of whether it's neat fuels or blended fuels. I mean, in Oregon, there was a lot of that was going on as well. I mean, in Oregon, there was a pipeline that we got the majority of our petroleum fuels on, but all of the biofuels, rail car loads, truck loads, and then imports and exports in and out of Oregon and Washington specifically, not so much California, but Washington and Idaho for us, right? And so it was a situation where there was lots of blending right at state borders, inside the state, outside of the state. It was challenging, but I think what we did was we came up with a way that, kind of maybe some default pathways, so you can make some assumptions about blends of B5s, B10s, B20s, that kind of thing, so that, because it is a learning curve for the jobbers in that case. And as the program matured, and as the jobbers understood the market better, then they got also better at documentation of what those CIs are. So then getting away from those blended pathways, because the blended pathways are always going to be conservatively high, right? And get better at accounting and splitting apart the bio part from the fossil part. So, I mean, that's kind of an evolution of the program.
Thank you. I'm going to take Eduardo and then Brian Bartlett, and then we'll move on.
Thank you. I want to echo what Corianne said, and I think at last meeting we discussed the possibility to have a period of implementation without obligation to actually analyze all the nuances from the supply chain reporting and all these mechanisms. I think all the presentations today will reinforce that for New Mexico to be successful, that will be a key step to it. So I wanted to reemphasize that.
Thank you, Eduardo. And Brian, you're next, and if you could be brief, that would be helpful.
Yep. So this is really just a follow-up to Carrie Ann's commentary around Oregon and Washington. Carrie Ann, with respect to the blended fuels that you're bringing across, utilization of, say, a default, soybean oil-based product for the blend, ultimately, I'm assuming that you guys were seeing jobbers that were wanting to transition pretty quickly into utilizing the real carbon intensity numbers. If, say, a producer or a terminal that was on the other side of the border was bringing in a lower CI product, whether that be a renewable diesel or just a lower used cooking oil, for instance, from Rio Grande, something like that, I'm assuming that the jobbers were pretty quickly wanting to go from a 75 CI to a 60 CI to a 30 CI. How did you guys manage the documentation requirements at the truck level? Because as I think about truck drivers picking up truckloads, what did you guys do to manage that process, and how does that apply to New Mexico?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so, yeah, they were pretty quick to change. I think, so as in the example that was presented before, if you're at the production level and you have your neat biodiesel, renewable diesel, you know what that CI is. And so a series of bills of ladings and requiring CI and pathways as part of that paperwork is what the paper trail is. And so it was pretty common for even out-of-state terminals to know what was coming into their terminal in rail cars, right, in bulk.
Absolutely.
What goes into tanks and then what goes out in a truck is where some of that complexity kind of came in. And it doesn't have to be, with the accounting methods for this too, it doesn't have to be every molecule, right? It could be mass balance accounting, methods. So at least on an aggregate level, you know what went in and what came out. And so it doesn't have to be that precise.
Thank you.
So when you think about that with respect to the California program, where there are the business-to-business reconciliations that happen each quarter between importers, did you guys institute that to cover the truck level with the jobbers as well? Because that's where I get to be concerned, is just the workload on the parties on these importations, because it's, from perspective, it's a significant number of parties who are likely not familiar with any type of historical government regulation in this case or in this style.
Yeah, that is true. We did require that documentation at all of the RAC transactions. And so that is a lot, but in the system, reporting system that does the reconciliation helps with that a lot.
Thank you. I'm going to move us along. We have one more prompt for this section, and we just have maybe one more minute for it, so we could take one or two comments at most. What are the dynamics at play that might impact New Mexico's position as a biofuels importer compared to other states with clean fuel programs? And a sub-question, what advantages might New Mexico have given that it's the first non-coastal state to have a clean fuel program? Go ahead, please, Jed.
I think there's again a real positive in implementing the program, not being a coastal state. For one, with the trucks and the rail, getting the product, the renewable fuels to the locations, from my point of view, is fairly simple. We already are doing that. In a lot of places in New Mexico, it's already being blended. And to follow, kind of back up on the last question too, the pathways are determined from the mileage that the neat product is traveling and to its destination. And from there, when it's blended or jobbed out, there's no tracking that needs to be done, because the CI value is already determined at the location where it is delivered to.
Thank you, Jed. I'm going to move us along. We have a presentation next from Graham Noyes about booking claim and credit opportunities for off-road vehicles. Graham, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Glad to be with you here today virtually, but quite sorry not to be there in person, even though I think you're probably a little bit warmer in the triple digits than we are here in Northern California. Look forward, hopefully during the public process stage, to getting into the state there and seeing folks. And just wanted to recognize Brian and Jed's great presentations here. And I think, pretty consistent with those, this presentation is really intended to provide visibility and perspectives on sustainable aviation fuel / alternative jet fuel crediting opportunities and other off-road crediting opportunities. And we'll see through the discussion that definitions really matter here. And sometimes there are different program definitions within a regulation than there might be in other places. And this will be one of the, just sort of the nuts and bolts sort of regulatory work that needs to be done to come up with the best possible policy design. I'm a regulatory attorney, spend most of my time working on low carbon fuel standard regulatory and advocacy issues, have been representing alternative jet fuel producers kind of from the beginning, worked with a group of them when we were encouraging CARB to include alternative jet fuel in the California program, and also worked in the same issue with Oregon, with many other stakeholders, including airlines and airports, and continue to work on the state level to expand sustainable aviation fuel policies, but have tried to craft this with different perspectives and options and so forth, rather than having a very sort of direct or any kind of particular agenda or focus here. So if we go to the first slide. So this slide is really intended just to show the scale of where we are, essentially starting from zero and looking for a very strong ramp up in the jet fuel sector. Alternative jet fuel and SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, are both drop-in fuels that blend with conventional fossil jet fuel. But they are really minute in scale compared to the conventional jet market. And as we see the sort of international standard of living rise and more folks join the middle class, we have seen strong growth in aviation with the exception of the COVID years. And we haven't seen, particularly for long-haul flights, any kind of feasibility for electrification, and hydrogen solutions are a long distance off, and different people have different perspectives on those. So folks really see the aviation sector as the one that is most in need of a liquid fuel that has that great high BTU content per pound. Whereas when you look at, particularly since you have to get the plane off the ground and keep it for a very long time there. So that's kind of the scale of the challenge and the importance within the climate policy space. Next slide. So just wanted to go back, and some of these things I'll move through quickly so we can stay on time target, but they're here really as resources. This goes back to when CARB was first considering including alternative jet fuel, and that was looked at and established as an opt-in fuel. And by opt-in there, the meaning is that conventional jet fuel is not incurring an obligation in the way, for instance, that on-road diesel fuel and gasoline do. And so in that respect, the airlines are not required to be lowering their carbon intensity, but to the extent that they uplift alternative jet fuel in California that has a fuel pathway, they can be they can be generating credits, and that of course provides value to the alternative jet fuel and moves the market forward, and that's really the rationale for including this kind of provision. Next slide. Looks like a little bit tight layout there on the slide, but we can talk it through here. alternative jet fuel is really a more flexible term than sustainable aviation fuel, in that it's just something other. I would say it's something other than fossil jet, and typically is referring to lower carbon, and necessarily within an LCFS or CFS program, a fuel needs to have a lower carbon intensity than the benchmark standard in order to be credit generating. But sustainability and SAF depends what program you're in, what the requirements are, and particularly in the EU, which now has a mandate beginning in 2025 for a percentage of SAF. There are very strict requirements on what the qualification is for the SAF, so just wanted to note that distinction for people, since you'll hear the two different terms. Next slide. So this is one of the other policy design issues, and this is from a CARB workshop. And essentially, what you'll notice here for 2019 is that the JET CI starting benchmark was CARB considered tagging that to the default CI for fossil jet, which was significantly lower than for diesel fuel. The reason for that is, as I understand it, and some people here I'm sure have a lot more knowledge on it, is because you don't have the desulfurization component. You don't have an ultra low sulfur jet fuel requirement, so there's less process energy going into the jet, and so it has a lower carbon intensity. And when you see what the bottom line, that gray line, the jet ISOR, that was the original CARB proposal, was to essentially have the line be parallel with the gasoline and diesel lines and be reducing the same amount of carbon intensity per year. And the problem was that would put the alternative jet fuel from a crediting perspective at a perpetual disadvantage relative to the on-road market, and so there'd always be less credit generation opportunity there. And so what we were able to convince CARB to do, and I believe Oregon also did, was to have a flat line initially that started at where the CI score was for fossil jet, but then basically when the diesel benchmark standard got down to jet, it pulled the jet standard along with it, or the jet CI measurement, so to speak, along with it, and so we had parity of LCFS crediting in that respect. Next slide.
Graham, excuse me, this is your 8-minute alert, and you can go a little past 10 minutes if you like, but it will decrease time for discussion.
Okay, thank you. So this is a CARB proposal to impose intrastate jet fuel. This is in the CARB rulemaking that's ongoing now. I'll say there's a lot of controversy in that, and there's not even within the SAF producers that I work with has there been a consensus whether to support this, and there has been strong airline opposition to this, and this is just a proposal at this stage. Next slide. And let's go ahead to the next slide. So this is the most recent CARB communication on this now from last September. And you can see they state that to further decarbonize aviation, staff is evaluating how to increase the use of alternative jet fuel in the state. So quite vague as to where CARB is from that. We will likely see the rulemaking package from CARB within the next 2 to 4 weeks. So we will get an update on that while the public process is going on in New Mexico. Next slide. And LanzaJet is one of the companies I work with, and they have spent a lot of time working on these issues and wanted to come forward with a recommendation, and this is a LanzaJet recommendation on policy design. So you can see these next yellow slides are LanzaJet slides, and this is looking at essentially how the renewable, during the time even since in 2019, when alternative jet fuel has been within the LCFS, that the renewable diesel market has been skyrocketing relative to the rate of increase of alternative jet fuel in California. Next slide. This is kind of a take-it-home slide, but it's really, and it's California-centric, but it essentially shows how there is additional value if you look at the total barrel and the policy opportunities on the renewable diesel side. And that's obviously an explanation for why RD has been growing so much faster than SAF production in California. Next slide. And this has some additional information, basically support for why LCFS programs should impose a requirement, and where British Columbia does have an exemption from its LCFS program, and in the EU has gone farther with actually a escalating percentage standard for jet fuel, and then also a subcomponent requirement for power to liquids fuel over time. Next slide. And this just provides more information on British Columbia. Next slide. And these are really just providing the California regulations that are operative here. So they're really reference slides of the obligated fuels, tell you who is deficit generating out there. Next slide. The exempted fuels, and you can see conventional jet fuel or aviation gasoline are exempted fuels. We haven't seen, to my knowledge, any crediting of aviation gasoline out there. Everything's been on the jet fuel side, and to my knowledge, there's not a commercially available low carbon aviation gasoline in the market. Somebody might correct me on that in the discussion. Next slide. And this is just how the opt-in provision is structured in California. Again, a resource slide for the discussion. And next slide. And all of this discussion has been focused on the jet fuel sector and spurring alternative jet fuel. We have multiple other sectors that, depending on the structure of the regulation, could be obligated or non-obligated parties, and those are, each one of them is really sort of a separate discussion on that point, and obviously goes to the statute and the decisions that New Mexico makes about those. To the extent that sectors are exempted, for instance, for dyed fuel for off-road uses, then those all create the same kind of opt-in opportunity where for those who decide, and we heard the great presentation from Taos about their work to decarbonize, the program structure enables this opt-in fuel as a way to incentivize that kind of activity for market participants, which drives the market faster and brings down their costs for decarbonization, so it can speed decarbonization in other sectors. Next slide. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, so we now have about 5 minutes for discussion. We have 6 questions. I probably won't be able to get through them all, but we'll just start one at a time. I'll ask if the NMED team can put all of the questions in the chat so you have access to them. The first question is how to avoid double counting credits.
Yeah, we can. I think the questions are a little bit more focused on the booking claim side. We don't have too much on the opt-in.
Okay.
So.
Do you want to indicate which questions we should focus on?
Yeah. I would say.
Maybe this one?
Yeah, it's 5.
Okay.
5.
What mechanisms do we need to evaluate the emissions reductions from off-road? And more specifically, when is it possible to leverage existing gas and diesel CIs to use for determining credits? And when is it necessary to determine individual pathway baseline CIs?
Okay, good. So what I'd say on that in terms of the approach that has been taken is, there will be a determination about what the curve looks like in terms of carbon intensity reduction within the New Mexico program. And then those, what are typically called carbon benchmarks, are broken out separately, as you saw on the one slide, for diesel fuel, gasoline, and conventional jet fuel. You could imagine, potentially having other standards there, but those are typically those are all being looked at for the fuel that is being substituted for, and that is how that is established and measured.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions?
Yeah, just right over Chevron. I don't think that there's a necessity to have a differentiated credit generation mechanism based off of the end use. So the comparison against the standard is based off of a carbon, equivalent amount of carbon dioxide emitted per energy unit delivered. So that's inherent within the fuel. So the degree that drop-in fuels like renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol are used in applications that are not transportation fuels, they would be able to use that same CI for the purposes of credit generation. And just thank you for your presentation, Graham. I think the only non-road application that was on your list that I'd like to highlight was the use of these fuels in rail applications.
Thank you, Joe. Corian, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just real quickly, I think at a high level, the only thing that I would add is that, as you consider these kind of off-road, applications, I think there is a huge opportunity in New Mexico. And so when you talk about rail and when you talk about jet, is that you do have to consider how much credit generation potential there is in also establishing the targets as well, because you don't want to get into a situation if there's an abundance of credits generated, which would make the standards easy to achieve, because then that's where you get your depreciated, the credit prices. So I think it is a balance between setting the targets and what those credits generated are.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I echo everything that has been said, and it will be interesting in the statute. There's nothing that it's attributable to the off-road or the aviation sectors, and like Graham's presentation said, these were not included originally in the other programs. They learned first how the program were behaving, and they incorporated these elements later. I think there's a great opportunity there, but I'm wondering if we should see how the program goes and during the periodic review process and analyze if this should be integrated, given that these programs are very complex at the beginning and we don't know all the carbon intensity, pricing, and all the elements that are going to be creating this market from the first years of implementation.
Thank you, Eduardo. So we'll give 2 minutes for the last question in this section. How do we keep off-road credits germane to the transportation part of the CTFS?
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot of judgment that goes into this policy factor, and Corian's absolutely right to point out both the importance of potentially these other opt-in sectors and figuring out the impact of them. So it's based on I think how much interest there is in the sector, how important it is from a criteria pollutant perspective, how viable it is, and how it's going to administer, how difficult it's going to be to administer. All of those factors ought to inform that decision.
Thank you. Are there any other, we can take maybe 1 or 2 more quick comments or questions about this? Okay, seeing no hands, I'm going to go ahead and call for a 10-minute break. Okay, I'd like to call the meeting back. I guess back to order. Is that how we say it? Back to order. And I hope you all enjoyed the break. Our next presentation is from Evan Rosenberg of SREC Trade. And I believe it will be about market dynamics, right?
Yeah, and specifically EVs.
Specifically EVs. Take it away. Evan, you have 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion.
Thank you. I'm fumbling with my camera, but I'll just start with the presentation to keep us on time. My name is Evan Rosenberg. I'm the Director of Strategy and Business Development for SREC Trade. There we go, got it figured out. SRA Trade's an environmental commodities management firm. We act as an aggregator and broker of clean fuel credits under these types of programs. And our focus is working with EV charging. So I'll be talking a little bit about how EV charging is represented in the existing clean fuel programs, and some of the common practices for awarding credits, pathways, and other things that might be considered by this group for developing the New Mexico program. Next slide, please. So I've brought my own source of charts and graphs for us to look at. It wouldn't be a proper technical presentation without numbers. So this is the distribution of credits in the California LCFS from 2023. As you can see, of the 30 million plus credits that were generated in the California program last year, electricity was the second largest source, just behind the bio-based diesel credits group and just ahead of biomethane. Sorry, not just behind biodiesel, but significantly behind it, but just ahead of biomethane. But what you can see here is there's actually a diversity of electric vehicle fuel applications that are all participating in the California program today. Things like electric cargo handling equipment, electric forklifts, refrigeration units. These are all technologies and equipment that can be electrified, are contributing to reducing the carbon intensity of fuels in this state, and are also able to be incentivized by clean fuel credits. On the next slide, we'll look at Washington State. So this is a program that's pretty new. They've just completed the first year of reporting and credit generation. And you actually see a very similar dynamic taking shape. Electricity, a major credit generator, residential EV charging, a major component of electricity, but already the emergence of a diversity of different kinds of fuel applications that are eligible to generate credits in this state, in Washington. And so one of the key takeaways here is you've got lots of different kinds of technologies that are potentially able to generate credits under the electricity sort of sub type, which is very different than some of the other fuel types, which are more concerned about the production of fuels and the feedstocks, whereas with electricity, there's a little bit more focus on the end use and the vehicle application. Now, the next slide, please. So what is New Mexico's distribution of credits going to look like, and specifically for EVs? I think it comes down to a couple key questions. The first one is what types of vehicle applications will be eligible to generate credit? So what kinds of electric vehicles will be eligible? We kind of saw what California and Washington consider to be eligible. Oregon has a similar approach. There are some uniquenesses across some of the programs. For example, Washington identified electric ferries as a specific fuel application. California and Oregon haven't. So there's obviously going to be state-specific vehicle types that may be more prominent or more subject to electrification that can be looked at. But ultimately, the statute doesn't define necessarily what types of electric vehicles are eligible for credit generation. So that's one key question, is what's eligible. Another key question is going to be who is eligible, or who is the default credit generator for each application. And then a final question will be sort of more of the how. So how do these credits get generated from these different fuel applications for electricity? What are some of the parameters and rules associated with how parties can generate credits, and what other kinds of mechanisms can they use to lower their carbon intensity? So we'll take a look at those last two questions in the next slide. So this is sort of our view of some of the common practices across the West Coast programs. Each program has determined that there's a default credit generator for each fuel application type. And again, this is just electric vehicles. Across the board, residential EV charging, those credits are allocated to the electric utility. And they're actually based on a formula Each state approaches it a little bit differently, but it's usually a combination of DMV records and then average charging estimates per vehicle. And these credits are actually allocated to utilities. They don't have to do a lot of reporting on the front end, but they are required to reinvest that revenue. Sometimes that's a statutory requirement, sometimes that's something that's been implemented. I believe there is some statutory language in the New Mexico program regarding reinvestment. So there's residential EV charging, and then there's kind of everything else, non-residential EV charging. And each state has approached this slightly differently, but there's kind of been an alignment over the last few years. And that all those different fuel applications I mentioned, forklifts, there's on-road EV charging, so that would be like public charging, commercial fleets, cargo handling equipment, ground support equipment. Generally, all of the state programs have determined that the charging station owner is the appropriate entity that is the default credit generator. And that has a really, really important implication that, again, separates electricity from the other fuel types, is that you're now having potentially participants who are end users, not producers of fuels. Most of the time we talk about fuel suppliers. Most of the presentations before we talked about fuel suppliers, people bringing and importing fuel into the state. For electricity, a lot of the focus is going to be on the end use. It could be a fleet owner. It could be a property owner who owns the charging station. So you get a really diverse set of potential participants in these programs. And so one of the things that has sort of created is the emergence of this industry of aggregators. So aggregators are like third parties who have created a business model where they will represent potential fuel reporting entities and generate credits on their behalf. So each program has sort of approached this a little bit differently. Oregon and Washington are a little bit more standardized. So they've actually created definitions for aggregators. The rules actually are a little bit more explicit about what aggregators can do when they get involved. Some of the rules around registering, these have become a little bit more standardized. California has essentially the same approach. It's just not codified in the rules. It's a little bit more implemented. And so aggregators play an important role. They kind of reduce the total number of participants that are going to be interacting with the program. Again, you could have every single school district that owns a charging station for their school buses. Each school could essentially be a participant in the program. Every single building that has a charging station, if they own that equipment, could be a potential participant. So aggregators kind of make it easier for smaller credit generators to participate in the program by centralizing that under one or multiple entities. I don't have hard data on this because it's kind of hard to pull, but I would venture to guess that for the non-residential EV credits in the California, Oregon, and Washington programs, aggregators are probably generating, again, this is sort of like an estimate, but maybe as much as 50% or even more of the credits generated from non-residential EVs. Again, not the utility credits, because that's a large portion of it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Evan. I just want to give you your 2-minute alert.
Perfect. Thank you. So there's one other mechanism for other entities to generate credits under some of these programs, and this is where another entity that doesn't actually own the charging station may, through contract, get the rights to generate credits assigned. So this could be, for example, a charging as a service company, which goes to school districts and says, hey, we'll build, operate, maintain a charging system for you. You can just continue to run your school. You guys can own the charging station. We'll finance it. We're going to handle all the credits and tax credits, rebates associated with this. So they sometimes participate in these programs as well. And each program, it's kind of an informal process. Sometimes they require like proof of a contract between two parties regarding who owns the credit rights. So this is another way there's participation. Next and final slide. So the last piece is regarding pathways. The way I like to describe it is EVs don't really use pathways, not in the way that the rest of the fuel types in clean fuel standards do. So typically you'll either have a default pathway, and we've talked before about how this could be a statewide carbon intensity average for the electricity, or a utility-specific carbon intensity. And so depending on where the charging station is, they'll just use that default pathway. Each program does allow for fuel reporting entities to reduce the carbon intensity of their electricity by pairing renewable energy credits, something sometimes called REC, book, and claim, to lower the CI of their electricity and generate more credits. And there's sort of an economic calculation here. The incremental clean fuel credits you earn by lowering your CI, if it's worth more than the cost of the REC, then you'll do that, or you'll attempt to do it. There'll be a financial benefit. I was going to do a pop quiz. What year do you think California enabled REC, book, and claim in the LCFS program? It's the year that the carbon intensity average of electricity dropped significantly, so about 2019. So all programs sort of contemplate this. It's something for New Mexico to consider, which is, should REC, book, and claim be allowed as a mechanism for reducing carbon intensity? And then what would be the parameters? So what RECs are eligible? Typically a tracking registry is used to make sure that there's no double counting. That would be Regis in the case of New Mexico. And then what other kinds of eligibility criteria are important to the state, right? There are renewable portfolio standards, and are there ways to align those with the clean fuel standards so that they're contributing to reductions? That's the last slide I think I have here.
All right, thank you so much, Evan. So we have several questions, and we have a little bit more time. Sorry about that. Yeah. We have several questions, and we have until 11, so we have about 11 minutes. So I'll go ahead and get started. First prompt is, should REC book and claim rules be established, and under what eligibility criteria should they be considered?
I was going to say, if nobody's going to say anything in the room, I think the addition of being able to retire RECs in a clean fuels program is really good for the overall program and for overall decarbonization in the state. Like Evan referred to, when RECs were added to the Oregon program, I'm going to go out on a limb here. Over 90% of the electricity on the non-residential charging side had RECs that were associated with it. So now, if you can think about this talking point, right? The electricity used to charge electric vehicles in the state is almost all carbon-free. Right? So it gives you another way. I mean, if you have renewables directly connected to a charger, you can have a zero carbon pathway. Right? So if you have solar, or wind attached to a charger, you can do it that way. But if you don't have that mechanism, there is this mechanism of purchasing and retiring the RECs to get you to that same goal.
Thank you. I'll take Kara and then Eduardo. Kara, please go ahead.
The interface of the RECs is an interesting idea with our LCFS. I am only concerned that use of RECs actually, contributes to the reduction of carbon. That's my only concern.
Okay, thank you. Eduardo?
I agree with Corianne. I think book and claim could be a good pathway, flexible opportunity to achieve the goals of the program, but I wouldn't not only limit it to electricity, but actually expand it under the technology neutrality mantra of the program. So it will be an indirect accounting methods, and we can generate the guardrails to make sure that there's no double counting or some other market distortion mechanisms within the program. But it's an important topic. It's a challenging one for all of us that do book and claim, but we definitely think that our technical reports should have some repository of best practices within the book and claim indirect accounting methods.
Thank you. Brian, you're next.
So I just want some clarity around the utilization of RECs in the concept here, and whether that comes from Carrie Ann or someone else I'm open to. But the concern I would have, obviously, around just an open REC system would be that you could take a zero CI electricity and move it out of a marketplace that has lower carbon or lower LCFS price structure and see zero reduction in the actual electricity generation in the state of New Mexico. And so the guardrails around what that process would look like and limitations, whether it be regionality around electricity or whether it be tied to a given utility and its actual activities within the state. I kind of go back to Travis's original presentation either last week or the week before about ensuring that they are both accountable and that they are in-state production. So just thoughts there.
Thank you. Kara, did you raise your hand again?
I did this, and I have a question for Corianne. Okay. Corianne, in the Oregon program, and I think in the California program, additional credits are awarded to the utility if the charging occurs through the use of renewable energy only. Therefore, I'm just wondering why would a utility, I mean, they'd be incentivized to account for RECs generated by their other facilities? How do we account for that, possible double counting?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, Kara, is so if you think about what Evan described as the credits, so that you have a carbon intensity of the state's grid mix. And in the Oregon program, we refer to those as the base credits. So those are your traditional credits that everybody generates. That is the difference between your fuel and what the standard is. But through the retirement of RECs is this generation of what is referred to as incremental credits, right? So these are the additional credits. So if you have a CI of electricity, just for example, a 30, right? So it's not zero, but you want to get to zero. So you purchase RECs against the amount of electricity that is dispensed. And that's how you access that zero carbon pathway. So just logistics-wise, in an account, that you will see generation of base credits and a generation of incremental credits. And it is in the details of how you set up the eligibility requirements of the RECs, where you can specify vintage, geography, where you can assure that there isn't additional, like it's already being used to comply with an RPS. Those are the things that are put into the eligibility requirements. And then the agency works with Regis to establish that, account for that, have retirement reports, and that's the mechanism to assure that it doesn't do all those bad things.
Thank you. I'm going to move us along to the next question or prompt. What EV activities should be eligible for credit generation, and who should be the default credit generator for these activities? Go ahead, please, Travis.
This is Travis Madsen with SWEEP. I guess my opinion is that we should include every kind of electric vehicle that's doing any kind of work involving moving around. And the default credit generator description on Evan's slide looked reasonable to me as a starting point for discussion. Thank you.
Kara?
Yeah, I think the key thing to just keep in mind here is that, electricity, as well as some of the other fuels, whether it's natural gas, propane, that kind of thing, I mean, you really, for the Clean Transportation Fuel Standard, you need to know that it goes into a vehicle, right? And so that's why in the case of electricity, because electricity is so ubiquitous, in energy systems, it's like, but you have to know that it goes into a vehicle. That's why the charger was identified, the owner of the charger is identified as that point. And so that's just something that I've always kind of kept in my mind, is like, what is the easiest way to be able to document that?
Thank you. Next one, should credit rights be assignable? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, Joe Serino with Chevron. Just to kind of build on that a little bit, I think, with the charger, you have a direct ability to monitor that amount of electricity it was provided directly into a vehicle. And I would encourage New Mexico to think long and hard about utilizing the assumptions about vehicle miles traveled within New Mexico, and have the if assumptions are used based off of vehicle registration, that is reflective of the use within New Mexico rather than a generalized use case.
Thank you, Joe. Go ahead.
And just a point I made last week too, but to make sure it's said, it is very hard. You can't get data from every single charger. As you all know, you can plug into a 110-volt outlet. So I think some of the ways that they've done this in the other states could help make sure that that transportation fuel doesn't go unused, and that utilities are appropriately credited for the fuel that's provided and used in the vehicles.
Thank you. Graham, did you have a comment or question?
I did, thank you. I wanted to just expand the conversation about book and claim for a moment, and this is a discussion that's happening very actively on the federal front around the various Inflation Reduction Act provisions, and also in California on the LCFS, and Evan did a great job talking about it, and Corian's comments were great also on the EV side, but something that the liquid fuel providers would like to do is essentially also have that same ability, which would be to source low carbon electricity through RECs, and that is perhaps most illustrated by one of the things I just mentioned on the SAF presentation, which is power to liquids fuels, which use typically electrolytic hydrogen and captured CO2 as the components to make drop-in fuels. And Infinium has the first commercial plant operating down in Texas that's actually doing that, not too far from New Mexico. That is essentially an energy-only enterprise. So if they can only source from the grid, which is typically the place in most facilities, they're going to have a very high CI score and won't even be a credit generating fuel, whereas if they can source low CI electricity, they can bring that way down. It's also beneficial for other producers and does create supplemental demand for renewable energy sources. There's lots of talk about making sure that the additionality is met and what the temporal period should be and what the essentially deliverability should be. But I just wanted to put that on everybody's radar screens as something that I think is really worth considering out there.
Thank you, Graham. We have a few more prompts, but I'll save them for later. And now I'd like to move on to a presentation by Gabe Siniak about environmental justice and CTFS. Gabe, you have 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Gabe Piseniak, UNM School of Law. Next slide, please. And thank you. Really appreciate all of the informative presentations and conversation that has come before. Just a few caveats. So I'm a law professor. I've done some research and scholarship around some of these issues, along with Carol Lynch, who's also a member of the Clean Fuel Standard Advisory Committee. But I don't speak for environmental justice communities. My students and I do sometimes represent environmental justice communities on a variety of issues. I'm not representing any organization or constituency on this advisory committee. So please don't take what I'm saying as on behalf of environmental justice communities. They can speak for themselves. I have reviewed EJ criticisms of elements of CFS programs, and that's what I've been asked to share today. And there's a variety of them. There's a California Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. There's a number of groups that have provided comments, particularly to California in the current program review. There's a Minnesota Advisory Committee that has had some EJ comments as well. And so I'm just providing an overview of what some of those criticisms from an EJ perspective have been today. And I'm not evaluating legal constraints or making any specific proposals, just kind of sharing what those general concerns have been. Next slide, please. So at a very high level, I've kind of broken them into a couple of different categories here, which first is that clean fuel standards don't necessarily distribute benefits of clean transportation equally among all communities. But all of our existing clean fuel standard programs do have mechanisms that do try to diffuse those benefits with equity in mind. And the enabling legislation here mandates that, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second is that clean fuel standards don't necessarily reduce conventional air pollution equitably. So obviously the primary purpose of a clean fuel standard is to improve greenhouse gas intensity of transportation fuels, but it has important co-benefits. And one of the concerns of EJ communities is that they don't always get distributed equitably, depending on how the program is implemented. And then the last is that some crediting mechanisms can maintain or exacerbate other types of upstream pollution, and particularly criticisms have been directed at dairy farm crediting and oil and gas pollution. Next slide, please. I'll start with talking a little bit about equitable benefits from clean transportation, and I'll note here that Kara and I and a colleague at Harvard Energy Environmental Law Program have co-authored both a shorter and a longer paper on these directed benefit mechanisms, and I've got a link at the end to the shorter paper. The longer one will be available soon. Basically, this is the concern that the benefits that a clean fuel standard program may provide, chiefly by directing credit value from utilities opting in to participate in the program, may disproportionately go to more affluent consumers. Now, California, Washington, and Oregon all include programs that direct those benefits to specific communities. Next slide, please. And so here's just a very high-level comparison. You can see that California, for example, directs its utilities that 50% of revenue must be used for the primary benefit of disadvantaged and low-income communities. Oregon isn't quite as binding. Washington directs 30% of revenue to benefit non-attainment areas or disproportionately impacted communities. You might notice at the bottom that these directives or guidance come from different sources, some from the statute, some from regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. And I'll just note that here we likely will have some split in jurisdiction, and Kara might comment on this more in the comments, because the enabling statute here does direct NMED to address these issues to some degree in its rulemaking. The PRC also has jurisdictions over electricity rates and service, including transportation electrification programs implemented by the utilities. Next slide, please. The authorizing statute here, as I mentioned, specifically requires that utilities choosing to participate in the program invest all of their revenue, not including costs, to support transportation decarbonization, with at least 50% going to low-income and underserved communities. Advance, please. So that's an important component of this program that will go to address equity and justice issues. I also just want to flag that the statute has this other provision that allows additional credit opportunities from activities and projects that support the reduction or removal of greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation in the state. And I just want to flag for the committee and for the regulators that this could be an opportunity for other innovative mechanisms that advance justice and equity in clean transportation in the state while moving forward the greenhouse gas intensity goals of the statute. Next slide, please. In addition to these the benefit concerns, there's also some concerns about program design, and those generally go towards the idea that some program designs can maintain or exacerbate industry practices that result in other pollution harms, or that they could be dependent on accounting procedures for greenhouse gas life cycle intensity that underdetermine or account for the actual life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that one of the overall requests from the California Environmental Justice Advisory Committee was a multi-pollutant evaluation of all clean fuel pathways that could be credited or debited. In other words, looking at not just the greenhouse gas intensity, but the additional pollution impacts. Now, I'm not saying that this law authorizes it or it doesn't. I'm just showing what that EJ Advisory Committee was recommending. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight 3 specific areas that were of significant concern to EJ communities. One was the potential for exacerbating dairy methane pollution. Generally speaking, dairies, especially large dairies and concentrated dairies, are significant sources of water and soil pollution. CFS anaerobic dairy digesters that can get credited under CFS can have the outcome of incentivizing larger, more industrialized farms. Now, this is not my area of expertise, but I have read some of the reporting coming out of UCLA and others. Their argument is that by directing crediting towards these anaerobic digesters that are primarily used in larger, more concentrated farms, they avoid a more holistic dairy methane reduction strategy that might include incentivizing smaller farms using other technologies that could have a lower per cow or per unit life cycle reduction, and that could also have lower other pollution effects from concentrated dairies. And so the concern, advance please.
Gabe, sorry to interrupt, but this is your 8-minute alert.
Thank you very much. So the concern is that a CFS program under the California model chiefly incentivizes larger, more industrial farms using anaerobic digesters and then over credits with negative credits because it is essentially crediting reductions from the agriculture sector, not just from the transportation sector. So this goes beyond the kind of transportation focus, and it isn't a holistic way to look at and reduce agricultural emissions. Advance, please. So the California EJ Committee advocated elimination of avoided methane credits in the dairy sector. Next slide, please. Second issue that was a focus of concern was concerned about bio-based diesel and indirect land use emissions, and in particular that the GREET analysis is not a sophisticated tool for doing indirect land use analysis, and that it could be underestimating greenhouse gas emissions from indirect land use that result from the production of bio-based diesel, which could both undercount the greenhouse gas benefits of bio-based diesel and could also exacerbate food prices. There's also concern that in California, the combination of federal RFS and state CFS credits going to the same products is flooding the market, and that arguably this unmitigated double crediting is not technology neutral, although I'm very aware that there are other federal and state incentives for different fuels as well. So the California EJAC called for a cap on lipid fuels and phase out of timelines based on this risk of undercrediting of GHG emissions. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide here. There's also been concerns raised by EJ communities about crediting carbon capture and sequestration. California has adopted a CCS protocol for its clean fuel standard. It is stricter than federal Class 6 requirements for the Safe Drinking Water Act because it has things like broader siting requirements and longer monitoring periods. There are still EJ concerns, however, that crediting for CCS is part of a life cycle emissions, for example, for direct air capture, which doesn't directly contribute to transportation fuel supply chain, would allow transportation-based offsets that will reduce incentives for clean transportation fuel development. And so the California EJAC recommended a prohibition on enhanced oil recovery as a eligible sequestration method, and not to issue LCFS credits for direct air capture carbon removal. Thank you very much. And this last slide, advance please, has both the California EJAC recommendations and a link to our paper on directed benefit mechanisms in CFS programs, and a longer paper that's not really focused on CFS but does have some information about the CCS protocol.
Thank you so much, Gabe, for your presentation. I will now read the discussion prompt, and I know you may also have some comments for Gabe. So we have almost 10 minutes to discuss how might NMED design a CTSF program to benefit New Mexico communities, especially those who live in low-income and underserved communities. Please go ahead, Travis.
Thanks for that presentation, Gabe. I think there's a lot of good information there. Two ideas that jump out to me, well, starting with the electricity sector, where the legislation has some language directing reinvestment in disproportionately impacted communities. A couple obvious ideas would be to increase the budget of the utility low-income EV purchase incentives, like the one that PNM offers, or to direct some more money into the EV car sharing program that Fourth started up in Albuquerque, giving folks who maybe don't own a car access to clean transportation. I think there's a lot of potential for those types of ideas, and I'd hope we'd keep it simple and just work it into the existing transportation electrification process that we already have up and running at the PRC. And then beyond that, I think it's worth thinking about how we could create some benefits for folks outside the electricity sector too. There's a bunch of folks who don't drive or can't drive or don't have access to a car, and they deserve to benefit from this program as well. And perhaps we could consider credits for public transit or paratransit services.
Thank you, Travis. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think generally the plain language of the statute we're very comfortable with. You will notice that it's that 50% is equal to at least the highest threshold that we saw here from California, and we're open to all ideas. If it's supplementing a budget from our current TEP, which already has a strong equity component, or other projects, definitely something that we're open to.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too, Oregon is one of those where the requirements for the spending is not in the CFS regulation. It's actually in cooperation with the Public Utility Commission in Oregon, and there it's at a 50% threshold also of expenditures to benefit environmental justice communities. And the reporting out from the utilities there is that it's in excess of 80% that have actually gone to those benefits. So even I think all of the participants in the programs, whether it's the stakeholders, the community-based organizations, the utilities themselves, have been a really good ambassador of that revenue and the spending for that, and have exceeded any kind of expectations.
That's great. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I don't see anybody online. Okay, not seeing any additional hands. We can move on to the next section, which is more open. We have the opportunity for me to read the prompts that we didn't get to before, and then any type of open discussion that you like. And we have until 11:45, so about 30 minutes. So I'll go ahead and read. Oh yes, do you have a question?
Yeah, so besides reading the prompts, is there a way that we can consolidate them all in the chat? That would be very helpful for capturing those.
Consolidate all of the prompts on the chat? Yes. Is that possible, Cole?
They are dropped in the chat.
They are dropped.
Sorry?
I think seeing some of them missing, so I don't know if you're doing all of them.
I have added all of them.
Okay.
Yeah, they're all in the chat. Everything's masked.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll go back to the first one that we missed. This was after Brian Bartlett's presentation. And the question was, how will New Mexico's CTFS program need to regulate deficit-generating fuels in New Mexico differently than the processes in West Coast states?
Sam Wade.
He just lowered his hand.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry, this is Sam. I was just going to make a comment about, in response to some of the questions related to renewable natural gas derived from dairy manure. Essentially, and we mentioned this last time in person too, we don't believe there's been any evidence actually shown that LCFS incentives shift farmer behavior in a negative way beyond the installation of digesters and reduction in methane from those manure systems. In the California program, each farm is assessed on an individual farm baseline. And so if a farm switched to liquid handling practices or in other ways increase their emissions, they would, essentially not receive any credit for methane avoidance. So happy to go into those details more, but just wanted to put a marker down that we don't agree with the conclusions mentioned by the speaker.
Thank you. Shall I move on to the next one? Okay. Next one is, what might NMED incorporate into the CTFS program to attract businesses and supply chains to New Mexico? New Mexico is interested in learning more about specific drop-in credit generating fuels.
As Joe Serena, I think one of the critical aspects, especially early on in the program, is providing a sense of stability. I think the concern was raised earlier about credit price or flooding the market with potential off-road applications. To the degree that there's ability to ease into the program and establish a period where all the suppliers are aware of who they are and are familiar with the systems before ratcheting up the standard would be wise, rather than trying to be too aggressive on the onset and maybe increasing up to a price cap and then dramatically having to change because of impacts in the consumer price of the product. So, I think from a business perspective, providing a clear path that there's a rateable increase in the standard as well as stability in the credit price would go a long way to encourage investment within the state.
Thank you. I'm going to take two hands that were here, and then we'll take you, Travis. First is Wish, and then Brian.
Yeah, the way I'm looking at this one is we have to incorporate the infrastructure here to be able to allow these alternate fuels to go on. In many cases, people can make these things. The problem is, how do you implement it and get it into the market? And by having something like that here in New Mexico for an infrastructure for some of these fuels, that makes a big difference into allowing or encouraging people to try their technologies here, to try to have their product in our state. Another cool thing to understand, which many people don't realize, is most of the states that have these clean fuel standards are large consumer states. We are not. Our transportation sector is tiny compared to most of these other places. So we can afford to do things differently than those guys can. So they can't just implement a different fuel and expect it to suddenly scale up to their levels. We'll be fine. In our cases, we can try these kinds of things. And so we are kind of those, kind of a pilot scale state compared to other states. And so coming to think of it that way, our risk reduction is already there in place because we don't have a market that's going to drag up, something and then fail later. So it's kind of, that's what I think you would have to do to attract clean energy guys into the state more, is to allow the implementation of those clean fuels into various applications here in the state. That's what we'll need to do here.
Thank you, Wish. Brian, you're next.
Thank you. So a couple of items there. One is that in terms of attracting business and attracting activity is on the onset of the program is to ensure that the pathways are available for parties to participate. And that means looking to the existing systems that are out there, and whether that is utilizing California, Oregon, or Washington as some baseline pathways to be able to get products into the marketplace. If you're looking to build all your own and certify every pathway individually ahead of a start in 26, it's going to be hard for parties to participate in the marketplace. So looking to some of those as ways to ensure that you get product flows this direction. And then secondly is kind of program stability and investor confidence. And this is really building on what Joe said a few minutes ago. And that is ultimately all of these parties, investors in particular, are looking for long time horizons to ensure that the investments that they make in New Mexico and in the clean fuels that will be coming to New Mexico, whether it's in terms of lowering the CI of gasoline or lowering the CI of RD or biodiesel or other items, building new plants, hydrogen, lowering electricity, whatever that is, take long-term time horizons for parties to build out. And so I think the state just needs to be really careful as you look to implement some of the sections of the regulation that look like they may be competitive, because this idea of having a cost containment mechanism that parties can then look to and rely upon, but then having offsetting structures that would say, how do we handle it in terms of forecasting and economic emergencies around those prices. And so, if you guys set a price and then reach that price and then undercut the program, it will undercut investor confidence in the process in the long term, and you just won't see investment in the state, in the infrastructure, or in the products that you need to come in this direction.
Thank you, Brian. Travis, you're next.
Yeah, just building on the discussion on market dynamics, I think it's going to be important to have a sense of what's going to happen when we launch the program and carefully balance the number of deficits we expect and the number of credits. And then also to build into the rule some, I think, adjustments that can happen dynamically without having to go back to the EIB. So maybe a cost containment reserve, for example, if the price goes above a certain amount, the state could insert some additional credits into the market and take some of the heat out. And vice versa, if the price falls below a minimum threshold, maybe we could consider some sort of an automatic acceleration mechanism where the standard would tighten and there would be more deficits generated, and help keep the price within a window where we're maintaining that incentive to invest in clean transportation while preventing any unwanted price spikes.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it's, under the statute, there is the periodic review process that also calls for an advisory committee, not necessarily the one that is here. I think that will be a good opportunity to review how the program is performing, how the credits are being accrued, how's the banking, how's the credit price, and also ultimately the impact to consumers in the retail stations. That probably will be a better avenue for making adjustments to the program than out to accelerated mechanisms. In California, that was proposed under the current amendments of the program, and it is too high level to understand really all the dynamics of the market and complexities, and it wouldn't even include issues with market distortions that comes from global pandemics or other issues. So I would suggest the Environment Department not to consider auto-accelerated mechanisms. They're oversimplifications, and rather rely on the statute that has a periodic review process with an advisory committee consultation for it.
Thank you.
Can I put in another
Please?
impromptu prompt?
Yeah.
Are there any other thoughts? I really appreciate the discussion on the automatic mechanism. I'm wondering if others have thoughts on that proposal that's currently being considered in California.
I think if you look at the difference in maturity of the programs and at what stage they are considering those mechanisms as a way to achieve the carbon intensity goals is, in my understanding, a direct response to a large credit bank and an ability to increase the aggressive decline of the curve. If we're not sure of the dynamics of running up a cost containment or the even ability to generate credits within the state of New Mexico, I don't think that seems like a great place to start with on a immature program.
Thank you. I'm going to take two folks online. First one is Evan and then Brian.
Thank you. I'll add more commentary in the submittal later, but I think the auto adjustment mechanism, which we do see in other environmental commodity programs that have markets, is something that should really be considered. It is another level of complexity, and we have to be careful about like over complex systems, but I think what we've seen in California and basically now in Washington and even Oregon is it's really hard to change the targets. You have to go through a very long regulatory process, and California, they've been unable to do that basically for over 5 years. And so they've not been able to adapt to the changing fuel supply in that state quick enough. So having some auto adjustment mechanisms takes a little bit of pressure off of the guesswork that regulators, economists, all stakeholders have, which is what is the fuel mix going to look like in 2028, 2030? Well, how can we possibly know? I mean, I don't think in 2019 anyone in the California program foresaw the degree of renewable diesel, right? That's a good thing. Like, it's a good thing for the state from an emissions reduction perspective, but it's made it really challenging for the market to continue to provide the signal that is needed. So I think the auto adjustment mechanism helps with that kind of thing because you don't have to go back to the rules. As long as it's clear and relatively simple, that would be the caveat. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Brian, go ahead. Brian, are you on mute?
Lost connection.
Oh, no, he's still here. Oh, here he goes. I think. No, he's on mute. Brian, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I lost connection for a second there.
It's okay.
So two quick items. One, circling back to Travis's comments and Eduardo's comments, we talked about market, the CCM price and market structures around there. I would really suggest that New Mexico ED take a look at the California modeling based upon their proposed amendments. Those amendments are looking at going into effect here in 26 likely, given the timelines, and their CATS modeling output for all of their scenario cases have 2026 priced in at an expected price of $221 per metric ton. And that's based on their credit modeling. Now, again, those are their models, they're their projections, and certainly could vary substantially from those. But it's just something that needs to be recognized as we think about what are the parameters that get set on the CCM, what are the basis for a CCM, and then how do the statutory off-ramps look. And then the second is with respond to an auto acceleration mechanism. I think we would support an auto acceleration mechanism. The key there is ensuring that program has both acceleration options and deceleration options or freeze type options in a scenario where the credit market is effectively pricing at the cap and everyone is buying out of their credit alternative option against potential future credit generations. In that type of a scenario, you would want to pause the acceleration process and have some sort of a temporary off-ramp style from year-over-year increases without credit generation occurring.
Thank you, Brian. If NMED staff don't have additional questions at this time, I'll go back to some questions about the EV market dynamics. That sound okay? All right. So this is a prompt we didn't get to cover related to after Evan Rosenberg's presentation about EV market dynamics. The question is, should credit rights be quote unquote assignable? And if so, how? Go ahead, please, Gloria.
Can I ask a clarifying question, maybe? I guess it's kind of, what was your intent? Assignable, like, outside of the regulation? You want it, like, you know, is eligible to generate credits, and then there's some other models. Maybe when we started off more like a hierarchy, if X doesn't claim it, then Y gets it. Oh. You know, if there's maybe like a hierarchy, if X doesn't claim it, then Y gets it, then Z gets it, or something like that. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
The latter, yes. And Evan can articulate this a bit more. This came after I spoke with Evan on the phone, but it is predominantly, so you're looking at different ways to assign credits that are both residential and non-residential for EV charging. And with the non-residential side, there is this sort of hierarchy of who do you start with? You know, is it the charging state? Is it the entity that installed the charger? Is it the property owner? Is it the aggregator? And can these? And so is there sort of an automatic system of like an algorithm of who to start with, who to go to next, to see who claims these? Should it be automated? Should it be opt-in? Is the regulatory burden for opting in to get an EV charging credit too burdensome that you just want to automate the process and remove that extra step to take? So does that kind of,
Yeah, sure. I can get to kind of the intent there. And I mean, maybe to say super high level with this, I mean, flexibility is good. You want to maximize opportunities for credit generation. I'd say implementation, it's a nightmare, right? And I think, you know, what Evan has talked about and what has been kind of referred to in the past, I think the sector that gets super complex is kind of these electric forklifts and warehousing and logistics, because you buy units, you lease units, you have an operation, there's a facility. Sometimes, you know, it's a rental forklift, right? So it's that rental company that owns it, but then it goes off to some warehouse for a period of time, and who knows what kind of tracking of electricity they have for charging. I mean, there's a lot of complexity. And so specifically in that kind of electric forklift sector, there was a lot of discussion about what is the most efficient way to do it. I would say that is, but for most of the other sectors, it's pretty straightforward.
Thank you. Are there any other thoughts, comments, or questions about this topic? All right, I'll go on to the next prompt. This is on the same area of EV market dynamics. How can EV charging credits be best distributed among the different eligible recipients? For example, OEMs, utilities, aggregators, charging station installers, and residents. And who amongst them is most needed to ensure robust residential and non-residential credit generation?
So I'll jump in on this one. So just a thought, I'm not sure and maybe the group can chime in on this too. I'm not sure at what times the utility wouldn't get the credits as the fuel provider of record. If we're able to show there's EV adoption in the service area and the utility is providing that fuel, I think maybe this wades into the capacity credits for charging network providers. Possibly this is for those applications, maybe with utilities that are not participating in the market. But for a participating utility, I'm not sure why the utility would not be the recipient of those credits.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Travis.
I think in one case where there's a commercial fleet EV deployment, fleets that I've talked to sometimes are making the decision on whether or not to proceed with the project or not based on the capital stack, and states with LCFS is where they're able to claim a credit for deploying an EV in a fleet. Can sometimes tip them towards actually doing the project versus not doing it. So I do see value in enabling, in particular, the commercial EVs to factor in that credit when they're making a decision about whether to proceed or not.
Thank you. Corianne?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of like an evolution of how it's going to like develop in New Mexico too. It used to be that it was just the charger owners for the non-residential kind of just got those credits, and there was no direction of like what to use the revenue from those credits for, because that was the intent there was to expand infrastructure, right? Put in more EVs, and that's what that investment was. But on the utility side, I think as some of these incentives, whether it's federal incentives, whether it is the state incentives, have developed, right, there are products that utilities now offer that actually do, say, pay for behind the meter upgrades that are needed for big fleet charging, right? And so the thing is that that the company itself, the fleet itself, can't provide all of that capital. So schedules that have, what the fleet will pay for, what the utility will pay for, what's ratepayer funded, what is clean fuels credit revenue funded, right? And that kind of, more clarity in those products to get those bigger projects in. Yeah.
Thank you, Corianne. Any other comments or questions on this topic? Please, go ahead.
I think at minimum we just need to make sure that there's a way to make sure that all of the credits that should be inserted into the market for EV charging actually make it in there, and that we're not leaving any of them unused.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no other hands. Please, yeah.
For in the electricity space, does anybody have input on the interplay between the Energy Transition Act statutory reductions, and our clean fuel statute?
I guess my very basic statement would be that the carbon intensity of electricity is going to continue to go down, which only increases the amount of credits that will be generated.
Thank you. Evan, I think you're next.
Thanks. That was kind of the point I was going to make, that you'll see a reduction in the baseline carbon intensity for electricity. And then back to the question regarding the use of renewable energy credits, you'd want to make sure that any renewable energy that was being counted towards that statewide goal is not separately and additionally counted for a clean fuel standard. And that, again, goes back to the use of tracking registries to retire RECs. I don't know what the accounting principles are for this act, but we just want to make sure that you're not basically double counting in the same program, in two different programs.
Just a moment, Gabe, did you want to speak? You had your hand raised a while ago. And then you'll be next, Alaric.
My comment was covered, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alaric?
Yeah, that's so just to go back to the REC accounting, that'll be interesting, and I'm trying to get my head around this, so thanks for your patience. But like for PNM, we'll be carbon free by 2040. So come 2040, you shouldn't be able to retire a REC on top of what the utility is already providing to that station. But that's where Regis comes in, I think, Corianne, to your point. And then it's very clear in Regis, and I've spent many, many hours retiring RECs, what that REC is retired for. It's not, RPS is one REC, and another one will be a clean fuels one.
Yep, absolutely. So that is the thing, is that as the electricity gets all carbon free, right? Yeah. So then the base credits from electricity will be like 100% captured.
Thank you. Are there any more comments on this particular topic or questions? Seeing no hands, we now have about 5 minutes for kind of open questions about any of the topics we've covered today. Additional comments you didn't get to make, please go ahead, Alaric.
This is, sorry, this is just one quick thought. I wanted to wait for that opening for this. There was a question earlier that I didn't address, which was what vehicles should be included. And there's another part of New Mexico statute, the one that governs our transportation electrification programs, that already defines transportation electrification. And just to read it quickly, the use of electricity from external sources to power all or part of passenger vehicles, trucks, buses, trains, boats or other equipment to transport goods or people. So I would just recommend we don't reinvent the wheel. There is statute into what those vehicles and uses are, and we could just lean on that.
Thank you. Was there a hand raised over here? Nope. Any other comments that you didn't get to express earlier, or things you'd like to ask of presenters? Please go ahead, Travis.
Back to the market dynamics, I was remembering a discussion in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative midterm review about this same problem where credit prices were going too low and wasn't motivating further investment in decarbonization in the marketplace. And what the team came up with was called an emissions containment reserve, so like the opposite of a cost containment reserve. An emissions containment reserve, where if the prices got too low, if in effect what it did was tighten the standard. And this is a different program. Obviously, transportation sector is not the power sector, but I think the concept is useful. And I think it makes sense to design a policy that has some safeguards built in to keep it kind of functioning in the way that we want it to function, with an eye towards achieving the carbon targets.
Thank you, Travis. I would also ask, are there any topics that you feel should have been or could have been or you would have liked to have been addressed during these advisory committee meetings that you'd like to talk about right now?
I think one item that we didn't discuss was project crediting and CCS protocols. It was briefly mentioned here, but we didn't get the opportunity to deep dive on it.
Would you like to do that now?
Anybody wants to welcome opinions. I will definitely provide comments through the technical reports, but it's something that I wanted to bring to the attention of the committee.
Thank you.
Yeah, Eduardo, I guess I kind of put that into umbrella of, I think the question that was, is there other ways to regulate the deficit generation in the state of New Mexico, right? With the refineries here, with the the deficit generating fuels here, how to kind of manage that. I mean, Oregon doesn't have any refineries, right? So we relied on out-of-state refineries to do our best guess of what the CI of the fossil fuels coming in is, right? And so I think the practice is generally you don't have refinery-specific CIs, right? There is a statewide average, and that's for ease of implementation. But as individual refineries do have projects that reduce emissions, right? That's where the credit generation from those projects kind of triggers. And so maybe incentive as opposed to regulation, right?
Thank you, Corian. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please, Lloyd.
Lloyd with Phillips 66.
Oh.
Just one point I'd like to make since you've got open is this issue of pathway development and getting ahead of that so that people can provide fuels for you in that pathways. Other states, it's a bottleneck getting pathways approved and how we're going to do that. And I would just basically encourage you to make sure that you're ready to do that. The concept of using existing pathways in Oregon, California, and Washington as a starting point is a good point. But you've also got a lot of ethanol coming into your state from out of state. To the extent that you can figure out how to incent those people to establish pathways in your state would be a good move in getting your program up and running as quickly as possible.
Thank you. We'll take one more comment on this, and then we'll move on. And Brian, you are next. Brian Bartlett.
So really, thank you. Really a question and a comment. So Travis, specific to your reference to the TCI on creating a containment sector, do you view what California is doing on the advanced mechanism for the current rulemaking to meet that kind of need in terms of a CFS program? The auto acceleration process, that is?
I haven't reviewed the proposal in the California rulemaking in detail.
Okay.
So I think that the concept makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that conceptually they're in alignment with one another. They operate and execute differently for sure. But looking towards that as a way to meet it between a cost containment mechanism and then an auto acceleration with appropriate off ramps may be a good way to kind of meet in the middle to cover both items. And then the second item was on the project crediting component. And I think this will come down to how New Mexico ends up managing the actual baselines for the fuels based on the way that the statute is drafted and how they do the implementing rules and regs. But, to Carrie Ann's point, in California, there are ways to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels that are actually moving down the pipe. But there are a whole lot less refineries that are feeding this system, or frankly any of the systems, than there are ethanol plants or anything else. And there are technologies that are being employed at those, which can include carbon capture and other items. And so the idea that you have a baseline gasoline and then provide or CBOB and provide a refiner an opportunity to show their carbon reductions. One of the challenges that I always have is that when you create it as a pure carbon credit generation is that the recognition that, hey, we're making strides in lowering the carbon intensity of actual fossil fuels as well gets bypassed, because you get assigned an arbitrary number that stays there for 5 or 10 years or gets marginally attributed. And the credit side that can be created by lowering the carbon intensity of the physical fuel ends up in your own balance, and no one else sees those activities. And the reality is that there are processes and mechanisms that are being undertaken by refiners today to do that. So it'll depend on how you set your program, but certainly if you have a baseline for gasoline, letting a refinery file for an independent pathway if they had such a mechanism would make sense.
Thank you, Brian. So we're going to move towards wrap up now. First, I'm sorry, did you want to say one more thing, Eduardo?
I guess a process question. So sure. Just to clarify, we have a significant amount of prompts that came up from this meeting, and we had already some from the previous ones. Is the deadline Wednesday for all the prompts together, or do we have a process for both the prompts to be submitted separately? Because more time is always better for more comprehensive input.
I'll turn to my colleagues for that answer. And Claudia's going to.
I think we're going to have to settle on that Wednesday deadline for all the prompts.
Wednesday, 5 p.m.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you maybe reiterate that?
Sure. For the folks online, we're just reiterating that all prompts, if you'd like to make responses to any prompts on the technical report, the deadline is Wednesday at 5 p.m., and that's next Wednesday. Okay.
Can I get a clarifying question on what is the best place to find all of the prompts, right? Because the thing is that you said find the prompts, do it in Word, and then copy and paste it into the system, right? And so where do we find all the prompts?
Yeah, so obviously there are more prompts that we've given out verbally in these meetings. Thanks. Yeah, good question. Obviously, there are more prompts that we've just provided in these meetings than what we included in that document. So if the desire from the group is to have those prompts available in written form as well, that's something that we can take into consideration and get back to you on. But we'll have to figure out a way of incorporating those into the prompt list that we gave you.
So as the alternative then is like, I just remember from the last meeting in the presentations, right, there were slides that had the prompt questions, right? So is that the way to go back and find them for the last meeting?
I think we will follow up with an email just with a Word doc of all of the prompts that we've had in all of the meetings, just to make sure that we have them in one place. Is that fair?
Sounds good. Thank you.
And just to understand, why are we rushing the process so much? Like, why don't we have another week, for example, to work all of this and have that meeting for the technical report? I understand there might be some statutory angles of this, but the 3 days to put all this together with the amount of questions is very challenging, in my opinion.
I'll turn that over to my colleagues as well.
I think one of the things we're trying to do is give us as the Environment Department as much information as possible that we've been digesting along the way with our meetings and this discussion, but also have a good technical report that we can rely on before we petition the Environmental Improvement Board. And we're anticipating doing that in August. And so we like to have this piece wrapped up. That said, we'll be continuing these conversations, and we'll be incorporating, we'll be listening to additional feedback on the prompts, especially as we get into, post-filing discussions and meetings and outreach around the rule draft. And I think that will provide the ability for us to be even more targeted in some of the ideas that we have been sharing today based on how we propose the draft rules.
Thank you. I see a hand raised by Brian. Do you have a process question?
I do.
Okay.
I do. So just kind of following up on Eduardo's comment, we understand the desire to have as good information as is possible. And certainly everybody on this committee wants to participate and provide you guys with that best available information. But when we look at the statutory obligations, the obligation to get rules promulgated doesn't actually occur until July of 26. And so, I know when many of us put in the applications, our understanding was that this was going to be a 7-meeting process running through the fall, and we would actually be reviewing rules along the way as a part of it. And that's actually in the statute as well, is that this committee will review those rules. And so the process and timing for just moving the deadlines up again, I think we felt comfortable with the 22nd. We've got a lot more prompts again, but moving this timing up now to mid next week, I just don't think you're going to get as good a responses as you could, and it to some extent mutes the ability of this committee to be useful in the process.
Thank you, Brian. Claudia, did you have a comment? You're on mute, Claudia. I wonder, can she unmute herself, or can you unmute her?
I think one thing I'd like to just clarify in the statute is that we're convening the advisory committee prior to the board promulgating the rules. And so this is an opportunity to provide input into what the rules look like as we contemplate our first draft. And we're happy, to have conversations about what details that are of concern of different, stakeholders and frankly the public at large when it comes to some of the provisions that might be at issue. And so this process has really been, from the beginning, per the statute, intended to kind of inform us as we, the New Mexico Environment Department, create that draft. And it's been very helpful to that end.
Thank you, Michelle. Claudia, are you ready to speak?
Well, thank you. No, I think Michelle covered it. That was what I was going to say, is that this has been really helpful, and there are multiple steps along the way, opportunities for input, and this is really this process is meant to inform the draft rules, which we appreciate your input on. And we are going to need a little bit of time to digest the input we get from you so that we can put that in the rules.
Thank you, Claudia. Would you like to also give the update on the next meeting on July 26th? Let's see if, hold on just a second, Claudia. Lloyd, did you have a question?
I just want to remind you, I would just want to remind you, and on top of Eduardo's comment, a lot of the energy companies that are involved in this process were in Houston. I want to remind you that we had a hurricane. Getting our staff together has been difficult. So as you rush this, you're going to limit the quality of the input that you get. So if that sways you in giving us a few more days to put those comments together, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead,
Strongly
Claudia.
second that. In one more week will make a big difference. Just to even that, it's just a few more days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the request, and we'll send out, we'll consider and send out an email with clarifications on the prompts and the timeline based on the input. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, Claudia, would you like to give the update on the July 26th meeting?
Sure. I think that you're all on the same page now, but we are meeting on July 26th, 9 a.m., virtual only. And the agenda items for that meeting will be to approve the minutes from this meeting, to discuss and approve the report, the technical report, and then we're also having 45 minutes of public comment at that meeting, up to 45 minutes. Right now, we're thinking that we'll take the amount of public commenters that show interest and divide the 45 minutes into that amount of time with no more than 5 minutes per public commenter. So that's what we're thinking for the 26th.
Thank you. And I'll add as well that I'll give instructions probably 10 minutes before the public comment period on how to sign up to give public comment. Yes, go ahead, Travis.
A couple of folks have contacted me with interest in the public comment period. Do you all have any guidance you could pass along to us about what we should tell people who are interested in participating? Like whether there's a WebEx link I should give them or...
It's the same WebEx link that we use for these meetings.
Okay.
So they'll just log in and about 10 minutes before the public comment period, I'll give instructions to members of the public on how to sign up. And then we'll track, who signs first, second, third, and I'll give them instructions about that.
Okay, so they don't need to sign up in advance?
No, and they can't sign up in advance.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Add a clarification on that. It's not the exact same WebEx link, but it's the WebEx link that's available on the NMED calendar event.
Oh.
That is always the place to go for these meeting links.
Thank you.
Okay, I didn't know there was a different link. Thank you for clarifying that. Are there any final process questions? Nope. In that case, I want to thank everyone so much for attending and participating. There's a question. Who's it from?
Catherine Williamson.
Catherine Williamson, do you have a question? I don't see your hand up. Oh, where can we find the meeting summary? I think that would be in the minutes, right?
I'll drop.
Okay. Colt is going to drop a link in the chat for you. Again, I want to thank everyone so much for participating. It's a lot of time that you gave to this process, and we appreciate that, and a lot of brain power and knowledge in the room. Would a member of the advisory committee like to make a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Eduardo. Is there a second?
Josrina, second.
Josrina, thank you. And Pam, would you like to call for the vote?
Yes, a vote on the motion to adjourn. All in favor, say aye or raise a hand.
Aye.
And are there any opposed? Motion passes. The meeting's adjourned.
Thank you so much, everyone.